We will continue today from right where we left off from before, which is at the section that talks about the writing of the Quran, the scribing of the Quran, compiling the Quran. This is not a hugely, but it is a controversial topic. A lot of people have done writings on this issue. A lot of people have spoken about it, both for and against. We have Muslims, non-Muslims that have written about it. But the fact remains that this is a theological point as much as it is a historical kind of point as well, inshallah ta'ala. So we're going to discuss the point of writing or compiling the Quran, inshallah ta'ala. So first off, the Quran has a chain of narration. My question is, what is a chain of narration when we say this? I hope everybody understands these words, and that's why we're going to mention this. Naam? Go ahead. Kind of. In Arabic, this is called a sanad, al-isnad. Who's heard of this word before? Al-isnad. Sanad or isnad. So what a sanad or an isnad is a chain of narration. So if I got like a piece of information, let's say from Brother Omar over here, and he got it from Uncle Ibrahim, right? And Uncle Ibrahim got it from Muhammad over there, we have now formed what we call a chain of narration. So I heard it from him, he heard it from him, he heard it from him. And then he's the source of the information. So with regards to the Quran, who can guess or who can tell us what the chain of narration for the Quran is? What is it? Very good. Okay, did everybody hear that? We'll repeat it again. He actually went the other way around. So the chain usually starts with you as an individual. So you say, I got it from, where did I get it from? My Quran teacher. He got it from his teacher. He got it from his teacher and his teacher. And it keeps on going back generation after generation until you get to the generation of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And then the generation of the companions, they got it from who? Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He got it from who? Jibreel. And he got it from who? From Allah Azza wa Jal. And then Allah obviously these are His words. So it stops there. That's the chain of narration. So the chain can easily go, like he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Jibreel, to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did what? He spread it, and he taught it to multiple companions. In fact, many companions. Okay? The Quran actually has a chain of narration. Any mushaf that you open up contains this chain of narration to prove its authenticity. So if you open up on the back, on this one, it's in a lot of people don't realize this, but it actually says it. Okay? This is part of the authenticity of the mushaf. Sometimes it's in the back, sometimes it's in the front, but it'll say this mushaf has been compiled according to the Uthmani script, which itself, and then it goes through the Uthmani mushaf, and it talks about its chain of narration. Okay? And who amongst the Sahaba are in the chain? Now, with regards to the Quran and the way that we have it, what is the primary mode of transmission? What do we mean by this, the primary mode of transmission? Yeah, it's actually verbal, it's oral. It's given through al-mushafaha, through learning, and it's not actually through written. So this is why there's a big misconception, which is an oral transmission more authentic than a written one? Or which one should be more authentic? The oral is more authentic? Why? The written is more authentic?
Because it has a human touch to it.
It has the human touch, but humans are flawed. Human beings are flawed. Sometimes their memory is faulty. Yeah, of course. The power of God is undeniable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We have revealed the dhikr, we have revealed the remembrance, and we will protect it. Allah will protect the Quran, this is without a doubt. This is part of our belief. That's why I said it's a theological point. Okay? But how can, if you argue this point with a non-Muslim, you tell him or her, the Quran primarily was actually oral. It was through verbal. It was not through written. Most people didn't know how to read and write. But you can easily prove to them that this is actually stronger, oral.
Does the text change from age to age?
The text changes.
Yeah, because
did they have printing press back then?
No.
How did they write? How did they copy it down if it's written? By hand. Would people be prone to making mistakes if they wrote it by hand?
Sure. Yeah.
Of course. Guess what? The Bible, inside of old Bible manuscripts, these are dated to maybe the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. You can see in the margins where they're writing their notes, and they're saying, I made a mistake here, I made a mistake here, this is a mistake here, etc., etc. Okay? And it's amazing things when you see these types of things. They themselves, they say, fear God, don't make a mistake, you made a mistake here, all these things, because they're writing it by hand. And if a written tradition were authentic, we wouldn't have so many different versions of the Bible today. Right now, how many official versions of the Bible are actually used in churches here in America? Does anybody know? There's over 200 different versions. And some of them, the differences are very slight. Some of them, the differences are huge. Some have entire chapters deleted, entire chapters added, verses gone, different words used. And all of them are based on some text. But if you go even back, right now it's called the Codex Corpus. If you just Google those two words, the Codex Corpus, online, you can find the old Greek manuscripts and how they actually differ completely from the Bible that we have today. And even then, they say this Bible is of the Gospel of Mark, dated from the 6th century. The Gospel of Mark from the 5th century is completely different. It's like you're looking at a completely different book, even though they know technically what it is. And that's written. That's completely written. So that's an easy point to point out. Now, with regards to the oral tradition, why is an oral tradition much more stronger? Well, number one, we have immediate fact check available. When we say a fact check, that means if I know a surah and I recite it, and everybody else also knows it as well, because remember, most of the Sahaba actually memorized huge portions of the Quran. So if one person makes a mistake, how many people are going to correct me? So let's say I read Surah An-Nas. Everybody knows Surah An-Nas. Can I actually make a mistake with so many people knowing the same surah? I can't. And if I do, everybody will immediately point it out. This is what we call the power of tawatur. When so many people memorize it from the source and then teach it to one another, we have immediate fact checks. You have immediate review. You can't actually make a mistake because everybody there also knows it. Imagine if a person made a mistake in Surah Al-Fatiha anywhere in the world. Would people immediately catch it? Of course they would. And they would correct them. They say, hey, you're reading it wrong. This is actually not how it goes. If a person said, Lillahi alhamdu rabbil alameen, you'd immediately stop and say, what did you do? You switched the words around. No, it's alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And so on and so forth. So because of this, this is a concept that's more known in the sciences of hadith, but we also apply it in the sciences of the Quran, because the Quran has the same chains of narration, the isnad, meaning where it comes from, the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the big Qurra and all these things. It's called tawatur. There are so many people who know it that a lot of things happen. Number one, we can guarantee its authenticity because there's immediately fact-checking going on. A lot of people will know it. So if I make a mistake, people will be like, hey, what did you do? This is a mistake. You can't. So it almost removes the possibility for a mistake, number one. And then number two, it also points to the fact that all these people in all these different places, as Islam grew, you had memorizers of the Quran now in Egypt, memorizers in Palestine, memorizers in Iraq, in Syria, in the Arabian Peninsula, and they're traveling around. All of them know the same Quran. And so if a traveler came, let's say 100 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and he sees here they have the same Quran, here they have the same Quran, and they're reciting it orally, you know that these people couldn't have come together in one place and then agree to lie about the Quran. They couldn't agree to lie because there's so many people who know it, and they know it differently, and they know it through different chains, then we know therefore that it's true. And so because of this, the oral transmission and the way that we learn the Quran that way, and the constant review of the Quran, because you can't just memorize it and then sit on your memorization, you have to review every day. This is why the power of tawatur and the fact that it is oral is actually a plus for us as Muslims. It's not a negative. And a lot of people try to attack Islam by saying, hey, your tradition is primarily oral, your tradition is primarily verbal, and that's actually a strength, and they don't even realize it. Because you're relying on the power of memory, the power of the social environment where everybody also knows it, and therefore there's no room for mistake. And that constant review makes it so that everybody is a walking copy of the Quran. And therefore this physical copy doesn't have that high of a status compared to a walking, living copy of the Quran in that way. And this is why when the Sahaba were asked, how did Allah protect it? Meaning that verse that says, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. Indeed, we sent down the revelation, the remembrance, and we will protect it. They said, how did Allah protect it? He said, Fi sudur nas. Abdullah ibn Abbas and Qatada and many others, they said, Hafidhahu fi sudur nas. Allah protected it in the hearts and the chests of the people. Okay? So that's why it's actually a strength. Now, do we only rely on the oral tradition? No. In fact, we have an added written tradition, which actually improves the authenticity even more so. But the primary one is always going to be verbal. The primary one is always going to be verbal. طيب. We have a question here. How many people actually memorized the Quran at the time of the Prophet ﷺ? There is a hadith that says that the whole Quran was memorized by 4, and they were all from the Ansar. However, on top of them, there are actually multiple Sahaba who had it almost memorized. And when we say almost memorized, is because the Quran is constantly being revealed. And in fact, in the last days of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran was revealed more and quicker than it ever was before. The revelation increased towards the end of the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime. Until the day he died, he was still receiving revelation. Which obviously tells us not everybody is going to be there every day to memorize. However, there were many Sahaba who had multiple surahs and ajza memorized. And these were called al-Qurra, meaning these were people who were authorized by the Prophet ﷺ to go and teach the Quran, to go and spread it, and so on and so forth. So we have here a battle that happened at the Bir Ma'una, which is the well of Ma'una. And this is where Bani Salim or Sulaim, they had some tribes like Dhakwan and so forth. And these tribes attacked some of the Muslims who were sent there to teach them Quran. The Prophet ﷺ sent 70 Sahaba, 70 companions to these tribes to teach them Quran. And what did they do? They slaughtered them. They killed all 70. This is a huge thing. But this shows us that there were over 70, obviously, because 70 were sent. And these weren't necessarily big names that we can recognize. These were just regular Sahaba, but all of them had large portions of the Quran memorized. And they went there to teach these people, and they slaughtered them. This is why the Prophet ﷺ made dua against them that Allah destroys them, and He did. Okay? Because of what they did. You don't betray something like this, especially He's trying to help. Okay? So, like we said, writing is still needed, since it is a book in the end of the day, and it helps with the person's memorization. So the book is meant to help with you as a mu'min, as a believer who cares about the Quran, and to assist your memorization. Which is why, like we said, the still main method of transmission, of protection, is in the hearts of the believers. Okay? So what are some of the benefits also that it is written? That we actually have a standard to go back to. It assists with memorization. It assists with recollection. Sometimes it's easier to go straight. You can focus a little bit better sometimes when reciting, etc. It has benefits, obviously. Okay? So we have a question here. This is a common question that comes. And it is, why didn't Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam write it himself? So did the Prophet ﷺ write the Quran himself with his own right hand? He did not. Why didn't he? Because he was ummi. He was illiterate. Okay? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Great thing.
It's a great thing. How is it a great thing?
Because Quran, like you said earlier, is revealed to his heart, not his memory, not his hands.
Uh-huh.
It's in his heart.
It's in his heart, naam. So the Prophet ﷺ memorized it in his heart and it was revealed to his heart. Which is why actually, so the standard of the Quran up until the Prophet ﷺ's death was actually his own memory. Meaning what was in his heart. Because Allah says, Allah can cause you to forget some verses. And Allah did cause him to forget some verses because those verses were no longer needed part of the Quran. These were called the deleted verses, so to speak. And this did happen. Okay? And there's also abrogation. And there's other things as well that we can take from this. But going back, if the Prophet ﷺ had been a person who was able to read and write, and he actually wrote it himself, that would mean that he would have written before this as well, and perhaps written after it as well. Sah? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept Prophet Muhammad ﷺ from knowing how to read and write for a purpose, which is what? To show that the Quran is from who? Is it from Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? It's from God. And that's a very important point. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mentions this in the Quran. وَمَا كُنْتَ تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ. He says you didn't write it with your right hand. إِذَنْ لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. Because even the mubtilun, the people who try to doubt you, would have even more doubts. But in fact, the fact that you are not an author, you're not a writer, you're not known for your poetry, you're not known for all of these things, is proof that there is no way that somebody like Prophet Muhammad ﷺ could come up with a book like this. Does that make sense? And it is very important for us to understand this point. Him being illiterate is actually a very good thing for us as Muslims. Him being this way, because if he was able to read and write, then they would have said, well, he might have gotten it from somewhere else. The stories of Musa and Fir'aun and Ibrahim and all these things, he would have gotten them from somewhere else. But he didn't. He got it directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would have said, oh, maybe, since he's an author and he writes a lot of books anyways, this is just part of what he does as a writer. But he's not a writer. He never said anything like this before. And this is why it added to their shock and their disbelief that the Prophet ﷺ didn't have that talent. He wasn't a writer. He wasn't an author, that he was able to come up with something like this. Not only this, but the Quran contains challenges. Find any contradiction in the book. And the book was revealed over 23 years. It wasn't like, here's the book at once. Over 23 years, tell me what you ate yesterday. You don't even remember what you had for lunch. Let alone what was revealed to you from the Quran years and years and years ago that you said part of it. And so the fact remains that over 23 years it was revealed to him, and not a single contradiction, not a single mistake. Everything is authentic, everything is there perfectly. This shows that it can't actually be from him as a human being. Does that make sense? And this is why it's actually a strength for us that he actually didn't write it himself. But we did actually have it written. So who wrote it? Many of the Sahaba, many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. This is 18, 19, 20, some even say more than 20 of the Sahaba that are known as Katabatul Wahi. So these are scribes of the revelation. So why didn't they compile it in a book during the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime? Why didn't the Prophet ﷺ himself say, okay, everybody, we're going to bring the Quran that everybody has, we're going to put it into one book? Was it actually gathered in one book during his lifetime? It wasn't. Yeah. So why not? Why didn't he do that? It was in the hearts, that's correct. But Allah says, Kitabun anzalnahu ilayk. It's a book that we revealed to you. But at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there is no book. It's an interesting phenomenon. Okay? This, by the way, is a testimony to how important the Sahaba are to our religion. This idea that I'm about to say. How important they are. A lot of times we underestimate who these people are. And this actually is a testimony to how great they actually are. Okay? Why didn't the Prophet ﷺ compile it? Because he couldn't. The Quran is not finished. Imagine writing a book and it's not finished. And not only is it not finished, but he's not writing it in order. Al-Baqarah is the second surah, but Al-Baqarah was revealed in Medina, years and years after many of the other surahs that were revealed. And then he would tell for the scribes, the writers, he would say, this verse has been revealed, put it between this verse and this verse here in this surah. So now they have to move verses out of the way and fit a verse in between, and it's put in a very odd order that doesn't make sense for any author to ever write like this. That's like you writing your book and you're like, okay, I'm going to write a little bit on page 2, and then I'm going to write a little bit on page 25, and then I'm going to write a little bit on page 75, and then I'm going to have a coherent book at the end. It's impossible. But that's actually how the Quran was revealed. And that's what he would go to the Sahaba, which even shows another layer of miraculousness of the Quran. Okay, that it was revealed in such a way and written in such a way. So there's no way that during the revelation that he could ever write it in one book. The book would have to be edited. He'd have to tear out a page, put in a page, add in here, add in an indent, and it would be a huge problem. So the Quran actually was not compiled during his lifetime, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ passes away. So during his life, before we get to his passing away, we have 3 stages of writing. How many stages? We have 3. The first stage is the prophetic stage, which means that there were certain Sahaba, they were entrusted to write, and a lot of them would cross-review, and then they would send it to others. Meaning, he would actually have a different Sahabi, hey, read what this guy wrote to me, read it back to me. And he would recite it, and then he'd say, okay, good. So in order to check the authenticity, he wouldn't just let it be that they wrote and then trust them to what they wrote. Okay? So this is stage number 1. After the death of the Prophet ﷺ, obviously the Quran is finished, no more revelation. And so now a new reality dawns on the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? And this is where we have Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's Mus'haf. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's copy of the Quran. Abu Bakr, we know he was elected the first leader of the Muslims after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. We answered that question, why wasn't it compiled during the Prophet ﷺ's life? And then we have another question, which is what happened during Abu Bakr's time that called for a Mus'haf to be written? And who pointed it out to him? Hanam? A lot of Huffaz were killed, yes. So that's correct. So what happened during Abu Bakr's time? A couple of things. Number 1, there was a battle. It's actually the battle of Yamama. And in this battle, a lot of Sahaba who had memorized a lot of the Quran died. And this caused for panic. Who panicked first? Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. He panicked because he realized, man, if all these people who have the Quran memorized start dying in these battles, what's going to happen to the Quran? Khalas. Because they're not surviving long enough to teach other people. They're dying in the battle and still fairly young. And so Umar panicked. Not only this, but now number 2, and this is another big reason, the Quran is finished. Now we know where everything is. Every surah is set in stone now. It's not going to change. And now we can actually sit down and write it and just compile it into a singular Mus'haf. Because it's not changing anymore. Khalas, revelation is set in stone. It's never going to change. So these 2 realities dawned upon them. And so we have the hadith in Bukhari. This hadith is narrated by Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, that he narrates that Zayd radiallahu anhu, he says the following. And I put the whole hadith in its entirety here as text in Arabic, just because the hadith is very straightforward and it actually goes through everything. And so obviously anytime we can take it directly from the source, we're going to do so, inshallah ta'ala. So I'm just going to read it in Arabic, and then I'm going to translate it so that everybody hears it. So this hadith is authentic, it's in Bukhari, and there are many other editions that are found in other books, but this is the version of Bukhari. Okay, so this hadith says, عن زيد رضي الله عنه قال أرسل إلي أبو بكر مقتل أهل اليمامة وعنده عمر. So he says that Zayd, now who is this? Which Zayd is this? It's Zayd bin Thabit, young Sahabi. He's fairly young at this time. Okay? And he says that Abu Bakr sent for me after the death of many of the people of Yamama, and in his presence was Umar. Umar ibn Khattab was there. So Abu Bakr said, فَقَالَ Abu Bakr, إِنَّ عُمَرْ أَتَانِي. Umar was the one who came to me. So whose idea was this? This is Umar's idea. Even though Abu Bakr carried it out, but it was actually Umar's idea. Okay, فقال إن القتل قد استحر أي اشتد وكثر يوم اليمامة بالناس. He says that Umar came to me and he says that indeed killing and death has become proliferant among the people on the day of Yamama. The day of Yamama, of course, was the battle of Yamama, in which they were fighting Musaylim al-Kadhab and the people who left the fold of Islam after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. But of course, many of them came back. He says, وَإِنِّي أَخْشَى أَنْ يَسْتَحِرَّ الْقَتْلَ بِالْقُرَّاءِ فِي الْمَوَاطِنِ. He says, I'm afraid that further killing is going to happen to these memorizers of the Quran in other battlefields. فَيَذْهَبْ كَثِيرٌ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. So a lot of the Quran would be lost, because these individuals are lost. And truly this hints at a larger reality, which is that knowledge is not what's found in the books. Knowledge is what's found in the hearts of people and in their actions. This is why Umar was not afraid of the books being lost necessarily, but he was afraid of the people themselves being lost, without us having any tradition to actually fully rely upon. Okay? This is important. That shows the value of knowledge inside the hearts of the people. طيب. He says, إِلَّا إِن تَجْمَعُوهُ. He says, يَذْهَبْ كَثِيرٌ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ إِلَّا أَن تَجْمَعُوهُ. He says, I'm afraid that the Quran will be lost, or some of it will be lost, unless you collect it, unless you compile it. وَإِنِّي لَأَرَى أَن تَجْمَعَ الْقُرْآنِ. He says, I see that you should, O Abu Bakr, gather or compile the Quran. Okay? فَقَالَ أَبُو بَكْرَ قُلْتُ لِعُمَرَ. Abu Bakr says, I then said to Umar, كيف أفعل شيئا لم يفعله رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Look at his care. He says, how, O Umar, how can I do something that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم did not do? Look at his question. How can I do something that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم did not do? This terrified Abu Bakr, and of course it should terrify us. Okay, in a real sense. Yani this person, Abu Bakr, is about to influence the religion until the Day of Judgment, which is obviously something huge. Okay, and that's why he was afraid of doing something that even the Prophet ﷺ himself never did, which is gathering the Quran into one book. فقال عمر. Umar said, هو والله خير. It is by Allah something good. Doing this, protecting the Quran from being lost, is something good. Compiling it into one book is good. فلم يزل عمر يراجعني فيه حتى شرح الله صدري. He says, Umar kept on coming back to me and talking to me until Allah opened up my heart to this. Which shows us that in the beginning we might be reluctant to do something, but in the end Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who puts openness in a person's heart to accept the certain thing that they are reluctant to do. Because a lot of times we don't know what's best for us. Sometimes we think this situation is best, sometimes we think that situation is best. In the end we have to trust Allah Azza wa Jal that He will put for us inside of our hearts an inclination towards that which is obviously best for us, inshaAllah ta'ala. And then he says, and so I saw that which Umar saw. قال زيد وعمر عنده جالس لا يتكلم. Zayd said that Umar during this whole time was sitting there and he was not talking. And this shows ultimate respect that Umar has for Abu Bakr, especially because Abu Bakr now is the leader of the Muslims. So Abu Bakr then says to Zayd, إِنَّكَ رَجُلٌ شَابٌ عَاقِلٌ وَلَا نَتَّهِمُكَ. He says, you are indeed, O Zayd, a man who is young, but you are very intelligent, and we do not accuse you. Meaning we do not accuse you of anything in your religiosity, in your practice of religion. Your Islam, the way you are, is very good. Your character and so forth. كنت تكتب الوحي لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He says, you used to write the wahi, the revelation, the Quran, for the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. فتتبع القرآن فاجمعه. He says, then we want you to go after the Quran and collect it, to find it, okay, and do research on it, and so on and so on. We're going to talk about his methods, the methods that Zayd actually implemented in order to gather the Quran. فَوَاللَّهِ, Zayd is now the one who's saying this. فَوَاللَّهِ Abu Bakr is the one who's saying this. فَوَاللَّهِ لَوْ كَلَّفَنِي نَقْلَ جَبَلٍ مِنَ الْجِبَالِ ما كان أثقل علي مما أمرني به من جمع القرآن. Zayd is the one who's saying this. He says, Wallahi, if he had tasked me with transporting an entire mountain it wouldn't have been as big of a burden as what they have just asked me to do. He understood the gravity of the situation. He's tasked now with compiling the Quran. That's not an easy task. He said, if I had to move a mountain rock by rock, imagine you go to the mountain, you take one rock, you put it over here, and then you keep on trying. He said, that wouldn't have been hard upon me, but this one was harder. So he says, Zayd is the one who's saying, قُلْتُ كَيْفَ تَفْعَلَانِ شَيْئًا لَمْ يَفْعَلْهُ النَّبِيَّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. How can you both do something that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do? Now he's asking Abu Bakr and Umar, and Abu Bakr says, هُوَ وَاللَّهِ خَيْرٌ. It is by Allah something good. فَلَمْ أَزَلْ أُرَاجِعَهُ. So he says, I kept on going back and forth with him حَتَّى شَرَحَ اللَّهُ صَدْرِي لِلَّذِي شَرَحَ اللَّهُ لَهُ صَدْرَ أَبِي بَكْرٍ وَعُمَرٍ. He says, I kept on going back and forth and thinking about this and reviewing it and going back to the person and talking to them until Allah put in my heart what He had already put in the heart of Abu Bakr and the heart of Umar. He says, فَقُمْتُ. I stood up. فَتَتَبَّعْتُ الْقُرْآنَ. I followed the Qur'an. أجمعه. I collected. مِنَ الرِّقَاع. Which is pieces of leather. وَالْأَكْتَافِ. Bones. They were actually the shoulder plates of animals. Because those shoulder plates were big, they could actually fit a lot of writing on it. وَالْعُسْبِ. Which is dried leaves. وَصُدُورُ النَّاسِ. And the hearts of the people. وَكَانَتِ الصُّحُفِ الَّتِي جُمِعَ فِيهَا الْقُرْآنُ عِنْدَ أَبِي بَكْرٍ. So then they compiled it not into one volume, but it was in multiple volumes. But it was all collected in one collected suhuf. So a collection of the books. Okay? He says that book that we made remained with Abu Bakr until he died. And then it went to Umar, because Umar was now the leader. And it stayed with Umar until he died. And then after this, it went to his daughter Hafsa, radiallahu anha. Of course, Hafsa is the mother of the believers. And she kept it until her death as well. Okay? That's the end of that hadith. We have a few questions on this hadith. So why Zayd? Why was he chosen for the task? He said, he was one of the writers of Wahi. That's correct. He's a very good Muslim. So Abu Bakr said this. He said, لا نتهمك. We can't accuse you in your religion at all. Your religion, your character, your this is perfect. This is why we trust you. What else? So he's young. I have this point. Being young, and this is what they said, means that his mind is more open. And his mind is more flexible. Compiling something like the Quran, did Zayd actually have it memorized, the Quran? Yes, he did. But they chose someone young so that he wouldn't rely on his memory alone. He would trust others. Because usually young people are more trusting of others. And the older we get, we tend to rely on our own devices, which is actually a good thing. That's part of aging. Okay? But and of course the youth entails that he has energy for a large task like this. Being somebody still in his youth, he's actually able and available for a large task such as this. He was known for his intelligence, and this is why they said aqil. They said, you're a very smart man. He had the Quran memorized, like we said. He was one of the scribes of the Quran. We know that, and this means that the Prophet ﷺ didn't choose anyone to write the Quran. He only chose specific Sahaba. They had to know obviously how to write, but they also had to be trustworthy that they were actually writing what he was actually reciting for them. And the fact that Zayd was already picked by the Prophet ﷺ, they felt better about this choice anyways. Another one is that they had no complaints with regards to his religiosity. And then the last one is that he witnessed the final recitation or review of the Quran with Jibreel alayhi salam. And we mentioned this last week, where the Prophet ﷺ is sitting there. Zayd was chosen. There were some other Sahaba who would go in and out, but Zayd was the only one who was there the whole month. He didn't miss a single night. And every night, he would hear the Prophet ﷺ review the Quran, and then the Prophet ﷺ would review with Zayd. So Zayd also got a review from the Prophet ﷺ. So we know that Zayd's memorization was perfect, because he reviewed it with the Prophet ﷺ right before the Prophet died. And he was obviously able to review it with other Sahaba, of course, so on and so forth.
Is there anything to do with the word Zayd being mentioned in the Quran?
No, that one is Zayd ibn Haritha. فَلَمَّا قَضَى مِنْهَا زَيْدٌ وَطَرًا زَوَّجْنَاكَهَا. That one in Surah Al-Ahzab is Zayd ibn Haritha. Right? And that's why Zayd is mentioned there. This is a different Zayd. This is Zayd bin Thabit, he's an Ansari. Zayd bin Haritha was at one point the slave of the Prophet ﷺ. Then he became a freed slave. Then he became his son, his adopted son. And then the Prophet ﷺ rescinded that because there's no more adoption in the sense of taking the name, but it still remained within the household of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? That's the Zayd that we're talking, that was mentioned in the Quran. So, what are some of the methods that Zayd implemented, Zayd bin Thabit? He said he looked everywhere that he could. He traveled a lot. He went to different Sahaba, went to their homes, went to their marketplaces. He said, I would wait at the door of the masjid for people to walk by to ask them if they had anything written from the Quran. Remember, he's not looking right now for oral traditions. He's looking for writings. If anybody has a piece of the Quran written, so people would come and he says, I have Surah Al-Furqan, great. Somebody comes and says, I have Surah Al-Nur, great. Somebody comes and says, I have Surah Al-Ahzab, great. And he takes his pieces, or I have half of a surah, or I have a quarter of a surah, or I have verses from this to this. Great, and he would compile it. On top of taking all of those, they would have to bring something written. He would require 2 witnesses to testify that this person wrote it in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So it couldn't have been a person writing it in his own home from memory. So if a person sat home and he says, you know what, I have Surah Al-Fatiha memorized, I'm going to write it. And I have Surah Al-Nas, and I have Surah Al-Falaq, and I have Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad, and I'm going to write it from my own memory, that he would not accept. He would only accept pieces of the Quran that were actually written in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So it would have to be written in the Prophet's presence, and the person would have to bring 2 witnesses to testify that that was written in front of the Prophet. So one person is not enough. So if the person says, I wrote it, okay, you're one witness. Where's the other one? You have to have another person with you to say that you actually wrote it as well, if you were the writer. Do you guys understand this point? So it's actually a very rigorous process that Zayd implemented. Okay? His own memory was not the basis of the writing. The writing was the basis of how they wrote it when they were in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. His memory was that he's filling in the blanks. He's like, okay, we're missing verse 20 to verse 30 from Surah Al-Furqan. Who has this? I need to go find it. We need verse 1 through 8 in this surah. We need verse 15 through... You understand how it's working. His memory was serving him in the sense that he knew what was missing and what he needed to look for. Right? But that's not what he used to actually write. They would copy directly from the writings of the Sahaba that wrote it, that were the scribes in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? There is a verse in Surah Al-Ahzab, من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه. This verse in Surah Al-Ahzab, that there are from the believers men who are truthful in their promise to Allah. And this is the promise is that they were going to fight for the sake of Allah, and that if they are killed, that they would like to enter Jannah. They have a wish for shahada if it's possible. Okay, and so Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying that they were truthful in this. That's the verse. The verse though, Zayd couldn't find it. He knew it. Many Sahaba knew it and they would recite it, but they couldn't find anybody who had written it down. Until he found one Sahabi, and his name is Khuzaymah. And he approached Khuzaymah. He says, Khuzaymah, do you have any other witnesses with you that you wrote this in the presence of the Prophet? He says, I'm the only witness. Then he and many other Sahaba remembered something about Khuzaymah. Khuzaymah was the Sahabi who the Prophet ﷺ, years before when he was alive, he said, this man's testimony is the testimony of 2 men. in a completely random incident. Okay? Khuzaymah was the Sahabi who testified to the Prophet ﷺ when he wanted to buy a camel from a man. He says, would you sell me your camel? And the man says, no, I don't want to sell it. He's like, I'll buy it from you for this much. Would you sell it for this much? And then he says, yes. He bought the camel. He made dua for the camel, and the camel was old and it wasn't that fast. But after the Prophet ﷺ made dua for barakah on the camel became quick. And he rode the camel, and the camel raced and was faster than all the other camels. The man wanted his camel back. And he accused the man, this Arabi, accused the Prophet ﷺ of cheating him. He says, you cheated me. You bought this camel for cheaper. Now that it's fast, it should be worth more. He says, I bought it from you at this price, all these things. And then, so they got into a dispute with the Prophet. And the Prophet ﷺ was about to just leave the camel to this guy. Khalas. But the problem with the guy is that he's disbelieving the Prophet ﷺ's statement and how business should be done. You sold it, it's the end of the story. One Sahabi was there. So the man says, he took this camel from me, he cheated me. And the Prophet ﷺ says, if I have a witness for me, would you accept him? He says, yes. So Khuzaymah was there. And Khuzaymah says, I will bear witness for you, Ya Rasulullah. The Prophet ﷺ says, you weren't there, O Khuzaymah. Khuzaymah, you weren't there. You didn't see me buy it from him. How can you testify that this transaction is valid? Khuzaymah says, I believe that you're the messenger of Allah. Right? Why wouldn't I believe that you did your business correctly? If I believe you in things that I cannot see, unseen, and realities of Jannah and Jahannam, and the Quran and the Revelation, all these things, why wouldn't I believe you in something like buying a camel? This is easy. He says, therefore I'll be your witness for you. And the Prophet said, are you sure you're going to be a witness for something that you did not see? He says, I already am a witness for something I did not see, which is Allah. But it's because I trust you as the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Prophet sallam, he says, indeed this man, and in front of everybody, this man's testimony is worth 2 of men, not 1. And subhanAllah, that later, years later, that came actually to be fruitful. And that the only Sahabi who had it was Khuzaymah, this verse written down, and he was the only witness. But because the Prophet ﷺ already said that his testimony is twice, khalas, problem solved. Okay? Very good. So Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu's Mus'haf, we have a few issues, a few points to point out. Number 1, the forever indebtedness of the Ummah to Abu Bakr and Umar and even Zayd, and what they did. Okay? Imagine now every time you grab a Mus'haf and you open it up and you read, guess who's getting reward? Without a doubt, those 3 people. Without a doubt. Umar, because he's the one who initially recommended it, he's getting reward every time we read from the Mus'haf. And I want you guys to truly think about this. And that's why I said, our appreciation for what they did should increase dramatically. Because if it weren't for their efforts, in those early stages of Islam, we wouldn't have this book in front of us the way that it is. The way that it's the same book everywhere we go in the world. Sah? Abu Bakr Umar for recommending it, Abu Bakr for actually carrying it out and authorizing it, and Zayd for the one who actually did the legwork and in reviewing everything that was done. Like we said, the Mus'haf was moved after Abu Bakr's death to Umar, because Umar is obviously in charge of the state. But after Umar's death, it went to Hafsa. Why? She inherited his belongings, that's correct. But I mean, why didn't Aisha, for example, inherit it from Umar? I'm sorry, Aisha inherited it from Abu Bakr, I'm sorry. Because Aisha is Abu Bakr's daughter. Yeah, so after Umar radiallahu anhu was stabbed, because remember, this Mus'haf, that one singular one, is considered a national treasure. This is the most valuable thing that the Muslims have at the time. Okay? And he kept it. Umar, on his deathbed, after he was stabbed by Abu Lu'lu al-Majusi, does he know who's going to lead the Muslims? He doesn't. And so he actually gave it on his deathbed to Hafsa. And he says, just Hafsa, keep it with you. Because he selected those 6, Ahl al-Shura, the people of Shura, those 6, and he says, you guys are going to choose the leader amongst yourselves. Go and do it. And the Mus'haf is going to stay now with Hafsa. But Hafsa is obviously trustworthy. Why? She's the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and she's the mother of the believers. Nobody's going to harm her ever. Nobody's going to do anything. Nobody's ever going to take it away from her. She herself is a national treasure in that sense. Okay? So that's why. Now we have stage number 3. And we only have two slides after this one left. So stage number 3 is Uthman radiallahu anhu. During his reign, he compiled the Quran and standardized it. And he did something that could be seen as something very controversial. And many people in the West try to attack Uthman on this point, but we will inshallah ta'ala show how this actually further protected the Mus'haf and protected the Quran from any distortion. So this hadith is in also Sahih al-Bukhari. It's an authentic hadith. All of these hadith are, by the way, found in the chapter of Fadl al-Quran, the excellence of the Quran. The book of Fadl al-Quran, and the chapter of Jam' al-Quran, the chapter of compiling the Quran. Okay, there's a whole chapter just dedicated to this topic, because obviously it's a topic that every Muslim naturally will eventually ask. Where did we get this book from? Right? How did it take shape? How did it take form? So this hadith is narrated by Anas ibn Malik. He says that Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman. So Anas is a Sahabi, very well known. He was the servant of the Prophet ﷺ for a long time. He's the narrator of this hadith. And in this hadith there is a man, his name is Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman. Who is Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman? What is he known for? Yes? The non-believers in what? Okay. Yeah. So he was sent as a spy during Ghazwat al-Ahzab, right, to go and see what was going on and so forth. Definitely. Why was he sent as a spy? Hudhayfa. And that's why I'm asking, like, who is Hudhayfa? Okay. If you know who Hudhayfa is, this hadith makes 100% sense. Yes. There was a war, yes. But why Hudhayfa? Hudhayfa specifically because he was what we call Amin Sir Hadhihi al-Ummah. He is the keeper of secrets for this ummah. That's his nickname. Why? The Prophet ﷺ gave him, and only him, the names of the hypocrites that were living in Medina. Hudhayfa was the only one with these names. The Prophet ﷺ came to Hudhayfa and said, Hudhayfa, these are the hypocrites, don't tell them to anybody. 1, 2, 3, 4. And in one narration, Hudhayfa says he named 80 people. 80 people who were hypocrites, full-blown hypocrites. The Prophet ﷺ knew who they were. It wasn't that they were secret to the Prophet. But he told these names only to Hudhayfa, not to Abu Bakr, not to Umar, not to Uthman, not to Ali. But he told them to Hudhayfa. And this is because Hudhayfa was a very unique character. Hudhayfa himself is the one who says, كان الناس يأتون رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يسألونه عن الخير وكنت أسأله عن الشر مخافة أن يدركني. Says everybody used to go to the Prophet ﷺ and ask him about good things. Oh Rasulullah, tell me about the best deed that I can do. How many times does the Prophet ﷺ ask that? So many times. He says, but me, when I would go to the Prophet, I would ask him about bad things. I would ask about evil, out of a fear that it should happen to me. So he was a skeptic. He wasn't an optimistic person. He was a very skeptical type of individual, Hudhayfa. And he used to always ask these questions that nobody else is asking. Which is why he was also the fitan expert amongst the Sahaba. Hudhayfa says that we stood one time in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. After Fajr, the Prophet stood up and gave a khutbah all the way to Dhuhr. Imagine one day, randomly, after Fajr, they finished praying Fajr, he goes on the minbar and gives a khutbah that lasts up until Dhuhr. Then he comes down, prays Dhuhr. Then he went back up, continued his khutbah until Asr, comes down. Okay, prays Asr, goes back up, gives the khutbah again until Maghrib, comes down, prays Maghrib, goes back up until Isha. Hudhayfa was there, and many Sahaba were there. He says all these big names that you know, everybody was there. He says most of the people that were there, some of them remembered, some of them forgot. He says, I never forgot. I remember the whole speech, everything from beginning to end. The Prophet ﷺ told them everything that's going to happen from his death until the Day of Judgment. This is why Hudhayfa says, there is not a fitna in the ummah that is led by 300 men, by a man of 300 men or more, except that I know their leader's name and where he's from. Until the Day of Judgment. This is testimony by Hudhayfa himself. He's saying this. So they asked him, who are these people? He says, I will not share their names. Not because I want to withhold information from you, but because the name is irrelevant to you. The Prophet ﷺ was mentioning names because he knew the name. But for you, if I tell you the name, and that person becomes a leader, a ruler, guess who that ruler is going to fight? Everybody who knows that hadith. And therefore the people of hadith will become victims of a war that is unnecessary, because they'll become targets, because they have knowledge of who will lead this fitan and whatnot and so forth. So he knew fitan, he was a fitna expert in the sense of any sort of calamity or problem that could take place. He knows how to deal with it, and he knows the repercussions, and he knows all of these things. So Hudhayfa is actually the start of what we're about to say. Hudhayfa is the one who recommended it. And this is very important because Hudhayfa had that knowledge. He knew that Islam had to be protected. Otherwise it would go the route of the Christians and the Jews. And this is why he says in the hadith. So we're going to read what Hudhayfa says. He says, Hudhayfa came upon Uthman, and he was fighting with the people of Ahlul Sham against, and they were conquering Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan and Armenia. Those countries there. Okay? And there were people of Sham in the army and people from Iraq in the army. Both. Because it's kind of in between both. It's near Syria but near Iraq as well. And they're attacking over there. And he says, I became terrified of how the differences in the recitation of the Quran led to differences among the lines of the Muslims there. The people of Iraq recited very differently. And even within Iraq, they recited differently according to who their teacher was. The Quran up until this point is according to different dialects and accents. It's ahruf. And the strongest opinion for what the ahruf are is that they are the dialects of the Arab tribes. And obviously the Arab tribes varied in their dialects. The Prophet ﷺ spoke a dialect of Quraysh, which actually became eventually the standard of all Arabic around the world. The Arabic right now that we teach, its origins actually are the Qurashi Arabic. But other tribes spoke Arabic, yes, but they obviously had their own dialectical variances in their own recitation. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself made dua. He says, Ya Allah, reveal the Quran in more than one harf, in more than one dialect, in order for these other tribes to accept. And they did accept Islam because Allah did answer his dua by revealing it in certain variances. So, and this is why the variances still remain. So instead of saying وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى, they say وَالضُّحِي وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى. See, a slight difference. And this is an accent. This is like a twang here in the southern accent or versus, a New York accent or whatever. You can still understand it. It's still English. But they have these subtle differences that they have. Does that make sense? And so the variances now that were happening between the people of Iraq and the people of Sham became big. And the people of Iraq were saying, no, our recitation is better. The people of Sham were like, our recitation is better. You guys are reciting it wrong. You guys are changing these words. You're doing this. You're doing that. And so Hudhayfa freaked out, and he actually left the battlefield. They conquered one place and they were about to march on. Hudhayfa said, I'm done with fighting here. I have to go back and fight for something bigger, which is protecting the Quran. Why does he have to protect the Quran? Because people are now differing. So he goes back and he meets with Uthman. Uthman is the leader at this time. He says, Ya Uthman, adrik hadhihi al-ummah. He says, Uthman, you have to take care of this ummah before they start to differ in their book, just as the Jews and the Christians differed in their book before. And Uthman realized that Hudhayfa is onto something. He's like, yes. Uthman actually said in another narration that we already have this problem now in Medina. People are coming from outside of Medina and they recite according to different recitations, and it's confusing the people of Medina. For the most part, everybody in Medina spoke a Madani dialect, which is why even now the qira'at that come from Medina are slightly different than the ones from Mecca, slightly different. By the way, the qira'ah that we recite here, most of us, Hafs and Asim, it's actually a Iraqi dialect. Okay? It's actually from southern Iraq. The reciter himself is from southern Iraq, just so that you guys know. A more Meccan dialect actually has wadduhi. They have a lean in it. Okay? It's not a straight alif, as is in Iraq and so on and so forth, like a Najd dialect. Just as a little side note. So Uthman realizes that, yes, I understand what you're saying. We have to gather everybody to one harf, one letter. Okay? So Uthman sends to Hafsa. Hafsa, the mother of the believers, she has the Mus'haf. She has the standard, the one that her father recommended and the one that Abu Bakr wrote, right? bring us the Mus'haf. So she brought it. And Uthman then told Zayd again, Zayd, you wrote this. I want you to come. I want you to make copies alongside Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Sa'id ibn al-As, and Abdurrahman ibn al-Harith ibn Hisham. Now, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Sa'id ibn al-As, and Abdurrahman ibn al-Harith ibn Hisham are all Qurashi. Zayd is from where? He's from the Ansar, he's from Medina. So these three are from Mecca. Zayd is from Medina. And he says, we want you to make copies from this original. So they have the original open and they're all copying with their own hands. Okay? And Uthman then tells them, he says, if any of you differ with Zayd, then you need to write it bilisani Quraysh. You need to write it with the tongue of Quraysh, the harf of Quraysh. So if you differ with Zayd upon how to write it, we're going to write it according to Quraysh. Why? Because it was originally revealed in their tongue. Which is why the Mus'haf that we have now technically is a Qurashi tongue in that sense, with the slight variations still being accommodated according to the qira'at. Okay? Once they copied all of these, they returned the original back to Hafsa. It's hers. Okay? So they respected her. And Uthman sent out copies to every capital of the Muslim empire at the time. And then he commanded, and this is a very controversial thing, he commanded that any other copy of any Quran that's written, whether it's a small amount, a large amount, a personal one, not personal, to be burned. We will only have a standard one letter. Everything else is to be burned. Okay? And this is still a controversial issue. Now it's not. I don't believe it's not. In fact, I believe that it protected Islam. But many people point to this and they say this is very controversial. Okay? So we're going to talk about burning the Quran. Number one, understand that having an issue with burning the Quran is actually not a new thing. It was even brought up at the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib, right after Uthman. Ali became the leader right after Uthman, and people were talking to Ali. They're like, man, what did Uthman do? He burnt the other masahif. What is this? Why did he do that? That's so brutal. That's burning the Quran, really? So number one, why do we burn it? This is actually the best way to dispose of any damaged or old copies of the Mus'haf, is that you actually burn it. Okay? We can't just, if one of these, wal'iyadhu billah, a Mus'haf gets damaged or water, or there's a flood, or there's a fire and it's partially eaten up, what do? We can't just toss it in the garbage. This is the words of Allah Azza wa Jal. We have to have respect. And actually in respecting it is burning it so that it's not consumed by anything else. And then the remnants and the ash, you can bury it in the ground. Okay, this is the best way to dispose of it. Because obviously you can't toss it in the garbage and so on and so forth. Okay? So we have respect for the Quran and the Mus'haf. That's why he ordered it for it to be burnt. But why the burning itself? Why did he have to get rid of all those other copies? Because they weren't reviewed. They weren't official copies. They weren't cross-reviewed in that sense. They weren't based off of the original that was compiled by these great Sahaba. There might be mistakes in them. The order might be a little bit off. They might be written in different dialects. Remember, the whole reason was it so that people don't differ that much in their recitation. And sometimes the differences in recitation, by the way, was big. Like they would write فَتَبَيَّنُوا. In one recitation it used to be فَتَثَبَّتُوا. Now both mean the same thing. At-tathabbut, at-tabayyun basically mean the same thing. But we have to standardize how it's written and how it's recited. And this is why the Quran is in the way that it is. So Ali ibn Abi Talib was approached. And then he says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ لَا تَغْلُوا فِي عُثْمَانَ وَلَا تَقُولُوا لَهُ إِلَّا خَيْرًا. He says, O people, do not become extreme in Uthman. Do not harm Uthman. And do not say anything about him except the good. Right? Especially in the masahif and him burning all those other masahif. Burning all the other copies of the Quran or pieces of the Quran. Because it says, Wallahi, he did not do this until he consulted with us. And he did not do this in secret. He actually did it in front of all of us. And we all agreed, including me. And he says, people used to come and they would say, what do you think about this recitation? And then they would recite completely different. And then this person would start to say, this recitation is so much better than this recitation. And Ali is saying, this is actually kufr. وَهَذَا يَكَادُ أَن يَكُونَ كُفْرًا. He says, if a person says, this recitation, meaning not how he recites, but the harf, the dialect that he's choosing is better than another dialect, this is actually saying that you're contradicting yourself in the sense that you're bemeaning parts of the Quran or demeaning parts of the Quran and elevating other parts of the Quran. And you can't do this. Okay? So he says that Uthman actually asked me, Uthman brought these people, Sa'id bin al-As and Zayd bin Thabit, and all of them wrote, and all of them cross-reviewed what the other person wrote. And then Ali says in the end, Wallahi, لَوْ وُلِّيتُ لَفَعَلْتُ مِثْلَ الَّذِي فَعَلْ. He says, if I were in charge at that time, I would have done exactly the same in standardizing the Quran. So what Uthman really did is that he standardized the Quran itself. This is what Uthman did, standardizing it into one letter, one way of writing it, one way of... This is why it's written the same in every mushaf on the planet. It's written exactly the same, and this is due to the standardizing of Uthman. So the initial compilation was done at the time of Abu Bakr, but then standardizing that didn't happen until the time of Uthman. Okay? So we mentioned this. What does the harf mean? The dialects. Why was standardizing needed? We mentioned that because the people were differing so much so that they would start to belie that what the person is reciting is part of the Quran and whatnot. And we need to standardize the recitation, we need to standardize the way that it's written. Burning all the other copies is to help in that standardization. Otherwise, if any of those unauthorized copies remained, they would corrupt the remaining one. And this is part of the miraculousness of the Quran in the sense that it was protected from those early days, and that's why we don't have multiple versions of the Quran. That's why we said, if a Christian, you ask a Christian, which version of the Bible do you read? It's like the New Standard Edition, Millennial, you have all these names, and there's over 200 different versions that are used. And so a lot of times, one of the first questions that a Christian will ask a Muslim, it's like, oh yeah, so you guys have the Quran, yeah, what? And you can easily mention, we only have one version. It's the Uthmani version. We've been using it for 1400 years. Okay? It's the same exact version. You can go any country in the world and you'll find the exact same mushaf. Even down to the inflection points, to the dots, to the vowels. It's all the same. And that's obviously something that we owe to Uthman ibn Affan and his effort. Okay? He also, this proved to be a little bit controversial, is that they also burned some copies of the Quran that also had tafsir in the sides. And this is particularly talking about the mushaf of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, one of the most knowledgeable Sahaba about the Quran. He was one of the few who actually had it memorized by the time the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud moved to Iraq, and he was actually sent there at the time of Umar to be the teacher of the people of Iraq. Which is why eventually when Abu Hanifa became alive in Iraq, the Hanafi madhab, almost all of its fiqh opinions are traced through Abdullah ibn Mas'ud because he lived there. Does that make sense? And so really the differences in the madhab are actually differences among the Sahaba themselves. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is living in Iraq and he lived there for the rest of his life. He came back during the time of Uthman and he eventually passed away during the time of Uthman in Medina. But for a long time he was living there in Iraq. And during when the Quran was being compiled, he got upset. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud at Uthman. He says, Uthman, why do you want to burn my copy of the Quran? His copy of the Quran, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, it wasn't a full Quran. He didn't have Surah Al-Fatiha written. He didn't have Al-Ma'uwidhatain written. Like Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq, Qul a'udhu bin nas. He didn't have them written. And some people now, when we say this, they think, oh, are they not part of the Quran? No, he knew that they were part of the Quran. He didn't see a need to write them down because he has them memorized. And everybody has them memorized. And there's no need to protect it from ever being lost in his mind. Do you guys understand this? This is why he didn't write them in his own personal mushaf. Some people might think that it was because he didn't believe that they were parts of the Quran. No, he didn't believe that at all. But on the sides, he had extensive notes in the hawamish, which is the side notes, the areas of his mushaf, extensive notes on tafseer, where each verse was revealed, a lot of this stuff. And he was upset when they eventually came to burn his personal copy. Because I wrote this with my hand and it took me a long time to write it and I took extensive notes, but eventually he handed it over. And he agreed. He says, I understand why you have to do this, but here you go. Now, was that knowledge retained? Yes, it was. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was able to retain a lot of it and to actually teach it, and this is why we have a lot of it from there as well. But even his copy had to be burnt. Now, like I said, initially he was reluctant to hand it over. And he actually had a tirade against Zayd bin Thabit. Very famous one. It wasn't that he didn't respect Zayd bin Thabit, but he said a word. He said, why is Uthman entrusting such a large task to a person who was yet a sperm inside of his father when I was learning the Quran directly from the Prophet ﷺ? He said that word. Okay? Yani he's showing how young Zayd is compared to himself. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he's like, who is this person? And not only this, he said his kafir father, because his father was a disbeliever. Okay? But subhanAllah, Zayd was chosen because he was the perfect man for the job. And eventually Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, when he saw what Zayd did, he actually commended him and he said, Zayd did a job even better than I could ever do. And now I understand why Zayd was chosen for this. Obviously the Sahaba had a lot of love for one another and they didn't just do that. Okay? How many copies were made of the Uthmani standard? We actually don't know. Some say only 4 were made, meaning each one of those Sahaba that was selected made a copy best. And some of the numbers go up to 6, 7, and 8. And actually 8 is one of the strongest. That there were 8 copies that were made from that standard, from the Uthmani standard, and they were sent out to different areas. One was sent to Egypt, one to Iraq, one to Mecca, one to Sham and Damascus, and they sent out to different areas. Okay? Uthman kept a copy for himself. And he actually kept it in his house. And when he was killed while reciting from that personal copy that he had from the standard that he had made. Because that's his what do they say, crowning achievement that he held dear to himself was that he was able to do that. Are there any surviving ones from the copies of Uthman? No, there are not. The Uthmani standard, there are not. And why is this? Because they actually didn't write on paper. They didn't have paper yet. This is written on parchment and it has a short shelf life. Paper lasts a long time if well kept. But what they wrote it on was not paper. Was a primitive form of leaves and leather and some other types of things, which meant that they were huge as well. Those copies, after they were sent to the capitals, Uthman told the people to make copies of those copies. And we actually do have some of those. So we have copies of the original copies, but not the originals. We don't have the originals. We have copies of the originals. And there's one of these copies in Azerbaijan. There's one in Turkey, in Istanbul. There's I think one in Medina still. There's a few spread around the world. Okay? That's it for today. That's all I have on the compilation of the Quran. Does anybody have any questions for me before we wrap up? Any questions? Yes.
Did you say that the Prophet's time was not written because it was not complete? Because different ayat that we put different. It was not confined in the Prophet's time.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
You say that it was not confined in the Prophet's time.
Yeah.
It was not completed yet.
Yes.
And it was not put in its proper sequence.
Yes.
That's the only reason?
That's one of the primary reasons. I'm sure there's other reasons as well, but that was one of the primary reasons is because it's not finished yet. And the Prophet ﷺ, the thing is, he never did anything unless he was told to by Allah, and Allah never asked him to do this. Meaning Allah never required him to actually write the whole thing into one book. But obviously Sahaba, knowing that it is a book, it needs to be compiled into a book. That's what Umar understood.
And Allah because he did.
Oh, of course, yeah. They accused him of trying to. They accused him when they rebelled against him that he burnt the Musahif. That was a bad thing, and obviously it wasn't. And many of the Sahaba came to his defense, in order to dispel those notions of why he did that. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, so what's the last revelation? No, that's not. Yeah, but that's not. That one is the last verse that deals with tashri', that deals with laws and rules and regulations, legislation. And that one was revealed on the day of Arafah in Mecca, during the last Hajj. But the Prophet ﷺ died in Rabi' al-Awwal, which is after Hajj. Hajj is the Hijjah, so he still lived all of the Hijjah, Muharram, Safar, and then Rabi' al-Awwal. So he lived for another three months. And during those 3 months, there was much more revelation. Like we said, the revelation actually increased during those last moments. So according to the strongest opinion that I've found is it's a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. Yeah, it's the last part. And it's the last verse that's talking about, it's the last verse in a sequence that talks about riba, but it's at the very end. And the verse itself doesn't have anything to do with riba, but it's the verse that actually finishes the section on riba, where it says, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. It says, and fear a day that you shall return to Allah. That's the last verse. Obviously that was revealed the day that he died, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
The same day?
Yeah. According to that opinion, that was the last verse revealed to him. And fear a day that you shall return to your Lord, the day of judgment. 280. It's right before the end. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.